The water is rising, and it does not care what it swallows. It is the winter of 1963, on a strip of riverbank in the far south of Egypt, almost touching the border with Sudan. The air smells of diesel and wet sand. Engines groan somewhere downstream, where a new dam is climbing higher every month, and behind it, the Nile is backing up into a lake that did not exist a year ago and will soon be one of the largest artificial lakes on Earth. Here, on a low ridge above the river called Qustul, a small team of archaeologists is working in a kind of controlled panic. They have weeks, maybe less. Every tree trench they open is a race against a shoreline that creeps closer with each report from the dam site. Somewhere under that advancing water lie villages, cemeteries, temples, and the bones of people who lived and died here for thousands of years. And, once this flood closes over them, no one will ever dig here again, not in this generation, not in the next. In one of the tombs, a large one, far larger than the others around it, its roof long since collapsed. A team led by an American Egyptologist named Bruce Williams is clearing away the last of the rubble. What they find does not look like much at first. Broken stone. A scatter of fragments, blackened and chipped, that once formed an incense burner. A ritual object carved from sandstone, the kind of thing that might be dismissed as decorative debris by someone in a hurry. But someone is not in a hurry, not with this. The fragments are turned over carefully, brushed clean, laid side by side, and slowly, painfully slowly, an image begins to reassemble itself across the broken stone. A boat, a falcon perched above a building shaped like a shrine, and in front of it, a tall, seated figure wearing a white, bowling pin-shaped crown, the unmistakable silhouette of the crown of Upper Egypt, the crown every Egyptian pharaoh would wear for the next 3,000 years. Except this tomb is not in Egypt, it is in Nubia, and the layer of earth around it dates to roughly 3100 BCE, the same narrow window of time in which Egypt's first kings were just beginning to stitch together the Nile Valley into a single state. Some of the pottery in this tomb, some researchers will argue, might even predate that. So here is the question the water is about to bury, unless someone asks it first. What if the symbols of kingship that we call Egyptian, the white crown, the falcon of divine kingship, the royal boat carrying a ruler toward eternity, did not begin on the Egyptian side of the border at all? What if they began here, in a kingdom that history barely remembers, a kingdom the Egyptians themselves had a name for, Ta-Seti, the land of the bow? That question has a second half, and it is just as important. If this kingdom truly was first, if it was, as some have argued, the oldest organized state-level society anywhere in the Nile Valley, possibly anywhere in Africa, then why does almost no one outside of specialist circles know its name? Why is it Egypt's pyramids that fill documentaries and museum halls, while Ta-Seti's cemeteries sit, until this very afternoon, quietly waiting under a rising lake? The honest answer is not a simple conspiracy, and it is not a simple triumph either. It is a story about geography, about trade, about a slow and brutal squeeze between two rising powers on the same river, about a culture that vanished from the archaeological record so abruptly that for decades no one could agree on what had happened to it. And it is a story about how the evidence for all of this very nearly disappeared twice, once around 5,000 years ago, and once again on this riverbank in the months before the lake closed over it for good. To understand what Bruce Williams is holding in his hands in 1963, you have to go back roughly 2,000 years, before the pyramids of Giza were built, back to a world where Egypt and Nubia did not yet mean what they would later mean, where two cultures were growing up along the same river, sometimes trading, sometimes competing, and where the line between them was not a border on a map, but a stretch of dangerous rock-choked water known as the First Cataract. Picture the Nile not as the single, gentle, slow-moving river most people imagine, but as a corridor, a green ribbon of farmland a few kilometers wide at most, hemmed in on both sides by desert that stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. For thousands of years, this corridor was the only road. Everything that moved between the heart of Africa and the Mediterranean world moved along it, or it did not move at all, and at several points along its length, the river itself throws up obstacles, cataracts, where granite outcrops break the smooth flow into churning rapids, rocks, and narrow channels that boats can only pass with great difficulty, and sometimes not at all. The first cataract, near the modern town of Aswan, marked the southern edge of what would become Egypt proper. South of it lay Lower Nubia, a long, narrow stretch of river valley running roughly from Aswan down to the second cataract, near the modern Sudanese border. This is the heartland of what archaeologists call the A-group culture, and what the ancient Egyptians, in some of their earliest writing, called Ta-Seti. The name itself tells you something about how the two sides saw each other. Ta-Seti means land of the bow, not land of the river, not land of gold, not land of the south, land of the bow. To the Egyptians, this place was defined first and foremost by its archers. That is not a small detail. It is a clue about how seriously Egypt's earliest rulers took the people living just beyond their southern frontier, seriously enough that the weapon became the name. By around 3800 BCE, and certainly by 3500 BCE, the A-group people of Lower Nubia were not living in scattered, isolated villages. They were part of a wide trading network that stretched south into the heart of Africa and north toward the emerging towns of Upper Egypt. Through their territory passed gold from the eastern desert, ivory and ebony and exotic animal skins from regions further south, and incense, the kind burned in temples and tombs across the ancient world for thousands of years afterward. Lower Nubia was not a backwater. It was a corridor of its own, a choke point on a choke point, and whoever controlled it controlled access to some of the most valuable goods in the ancient Nile world. And at the same time, on the other side of that first cataract, something else was happening. In Upper Egypt, a cluster of competing towns, Nakada, Hierakonpolis, Abydos, were growing larger, richer, and more centralized. Archaeologists call this period Nakada III, sometimes Dynasty Zero, the decades right before Egypt's traditional First Dynasty. It was a period of consolidation, of local rulers absorbing or crushing their neighbors, of symbols of kingship, crowns, scepters, the image of a ruler smiting his enemies, beginning to crystallize into the visual language that would define Egyptian civilization for the next 3,000 years. Two cultures, both growing more centralized, both developing the trappings of kingship, both depending on the same narrow ribbon of river and the same trade routes, separated by a stretch of dangerous rapids that was more of a filter than a wall. That is the collision course. Not a single dramatic invasion on a single dramatic day, but a slow tightening, a gradual narrowing of options, playing out over generations. Now meet some of the people caught in it, or as close as we can get to meeting them. 5,000 years later, with no names, only graves. In Tomb L24 at Qustul, the same tomb Bruce Williams will excavate in 1963, lies a man buried with extraordinary wealth for his time. We do not know his name. No A-group writing survives that could tell us. But we know what was placed around him. Pottery vessels by the dozen, some of them imported from Egypt, some of them in the distinctive black-topped, polished style that A-group craftsmen were famous for. We know his tomb was larger than those around it, set apart, built to be seen. And we know that somewhere in the wreckage of that tomb lay the broken incense burner with the seated figure in the white crown, the falcon, the boat. Imagery that, if it really does depict a ruler of Ta-Seti wearing the crown of kingship, would make this unnamed man one of the earliest kings anywhere in the Nile Valley, Egyptian or Nubian. That claim, when Williams eventually published it, would not sit quietly in academic journals. It would become one of the more heated debates in Egyptology, a debate that, in its quieter form, is still going on today. Some scholars accepted that the imagery showed a Nubian ruler with the trappings of kingship before Egypt's first dynasty began. Others pushed back hard, questioning the dating, questioning whether the seated figure was really a king at all, rather than a different kind of symbolic image, and arguing that the similarities were the result of two neighboring cultures sharing a common visual vocabulary, rather than one culture borrowing wholesale from the other. What can be said with confidence is this: the people of Ta-Seti were not a passive, peripheral population waiting to be civilized by their northern neighbors. They had wealth, they had trade networks, they had a social hierarchy steep enough to produce tombs like L24, and they were doing all of this at almost exactly the same moment that Egypt's earliest kings was doing the same thing, a few hundred kilometers downstream. Whether the crown came from the south or the north, or whether both sides simply arrived at similar answers to similar questions about how to display power, is one of those places where the evidence runs out before the story does. Historians can say what is likely. They cannot yet say what is certain. And that uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Step away from the tombs of kings for a moment and walk instead with someone who never had a tomb at all. Imagine a boatman, we'll call him by no name, because none survives, working the river just below the first cataract sometime around 3200 BCE. His cargo is modest: sacks of dried fish, a few coils of rope, perhaps a small quantity of raw copper traded down from somewhere to the north. He has made this run dozens of times. He knows which channels are passable at this time of year and which will tear the bottom out of his reed and wood boat if he misjudges the current by even a few meters. He knows the cataract not as a line on a map but as a sound, a low roar that builds for an hour before he reaches it, a roar that tells him exactly how much water is coming through this season, and therefore exactly how careful he needs to be. He has heard, from traders coming downriver, that the towns to the north are changing. Not dramatically, not in a way he could point to, but in the way that rumors travel along a trade route. More soldiers seen near the river towns, more demands from local chiefs for tribute, fewer independent traders making the crossing on their own. He doesn't think much of it. People have always demanded things from people who pass through. But if you could ask him, years later, whether he noticed anything different in those final seasons before everything changed, he might say yes. He might say the river felt the same, but the people on it did not. That feeling, vague, hard to pin down, but real, is what historians sometimes call the texture of a slow crisis. No single event marks it. No battle, no treaty, no proclamation. Just a gradual shift in who controls what, who answers to whom, and how much room ordinary people have to move. On the other side of the cataract, in the towns of Upper Egypt, that shift had a face, or rather, a series of faces, because the consolidation of Egypt under its earliest kings was not the work of one man but of a generation of rulers whose names survive only in fragments. Ivory labels, stone pallets, the occasional inscription scratched into rock at the edge of the desert. One of those inscriptions matters enormously to this story. At a place called Gebel Sheikh Suleiman, deep in Lower Nubia, near the Second Cataract, there is a carving on a rock face that shows a ruler, almost certainly an early Egyptian king, from the very start of the First Dynasty, or just before it, standing over a scene of bound captives and the dead. The figures are labeled in the crude but unmistakable way early Egyptian art labeled its enemies, as people of Nubia. Boats are shown, bodies are shown, some of them face down in what appears to be water. It is, by a wide margin, one of the earliest depictions of organized warfare anywhere in the ancient world, and it is aimed squarely south, into the heart of Ta-Seti's territory. We cannot reconstruct this as a single battle with a name, a date, and a casualty count, the way we might for a war fought 2,000 years later. The relief is a single image, not a campaign history, but its message is not ambiguous. Sometime around the unification of Egypt, in the decades on either side of 3100 BCE, Egyptian power reached south of the First Cataract not as a trading partner, but as an armed force, and it left a record of violence carved into the living rock for anyone coming up the river to see. Now picture a young man on the Egyptian side of that frontier, a soldier, maybe 18 or 19 years old, conscripted or recruited from one of the towns near Hierakonpolis, marching south along the riverbank with a small column of others like him. He has never been this far south before. The desert presses close on both sides here. In places, the cultivated strip is barely wide enough for the column to walk single file along its edge, river on one side, baked orange rock on the other. The heat by midday is the kind that makes the air itself seem to shimmer and bend. He carries a mace, heavy, stone-headed, the standard weapon of this period, more crushing than cutting. And perhaps a bow, because everyone, on both sides of this frontier, knows how to use a bow. He has heard that the people to the south are dangerous. He has heard their archers can put an arrow through a shield at a range his own people consider safe. He does not know, and has no way of knowing, that the kingdom he is marching toward has cemeteries holding tombs as rich as some of the ones back home, that its craftsmen make pottery so fine that Egyptian elites import it as a luxury good, that its rulers may already be using some of the same symbols of power his own king uses. To him, Ta-Seti is simply the south, a place of bows, a place his commanders have told him is both valuable and hostile, and therefore a place worth controlling. This is how frontiers work, then and now. The people living on them rarely see the whole picture. They see a roar at the edge of hearing that grows louder each season. They see more soldiers. They see fewer independent traders. They feel a tightening they cannot name, until one day the tightening has a name, and by then it is too late to do much about it. And then, and this is the part of the story that historians have spent decades arguing about, Ta-Seti goes quiet, not instantly, not in a single recorded massacre with a body count we can cite. The archaeological record does not work that way. It does not hand us a date and a death toll the way a written chronicle might. What it hands us instead is something more unsettling, a culture that is clearly thriving. Rich tombs, imported goods, large cemeteries, distinctive pottery, and then, in a span of time that archaeologists measure in a couple of centuries at most, simply isn't there anymore. By roughly 2900 BCE, the distinctive A-group culture of Lower Nubia has effectively disappeared from the record. The cemeteries stop being used. The settlements are abandoned or shrink to almost nothing. For the next several centuries, what some archaeologists call a hiatus, lasting close to 1,000 years. Lower Nubia goes nearly silent in the archaeological evidence, before a new culture, the C group, eventually appears in the same region with a different material culture entirely. What happened in that gap is the central, unresolved mystery of Ta-Seti's story, and it is exactly the kind of question that gets flattened into a single dramatic word, vanished or wiped out, when the truth is messier and in some ways more disturbing. One explanation, the one suggested most directly by the Gibil Sheikh Suleiman relief, is military conquest and displacement, that Egypt's newly unified state, having just finished forcibly stitching together its own upper and lower halves, turned its now considerable military organization southward and either destroyed Ta-Seti's ruling class outright or drove much of the population out of Lower Nubia entirely, perhaps southward into Upper Nubia, where some researchers believe A-group populations and traditions may have continued in a different form. A second explanation focuses not on swords and arrows, but on something quieter and, in its way, just as devastating: trade. Lower Nubia's wealth and importance came largely from its role as a corridor, a place where goods from further south were gathered, processed, and passed north. But once Egypt was unified into a single state with its own administration, its own expeditions, and increasingly its own direct access to the resources of the south, sending its own boats and its own agents past the cataracts rather than relying on Nubian middlemen, that corridor role could have collapsed economically, almost overnight by historical standards, without a single battle being fought. A kingdom whose wealth depends on being the necessary middleman does not need to be destroyed by an army. It can simply be made irrelevant. A third explanation, less dramatic but taken seriously by some researchers, points to environmental change, shifts in rainfall and river flow at the end of this period that may have made parts of Lower Nubia less viable for the kind of agriculture and trade-based settlement the A group depended on. Independent of anything Egypt did, the honest position, the one most careful historians actually hold, is that these explanations are not mutually exclusive, and that we do not have enough evidence to rank them with confidence. What we can say is this: the disappearance of Ta-Seti as a distinct, visible culture coincides with uncomfortable precision with the rise of a unified Egyptian state directly to its north. A state that, on at least one occasion, carved a record of victory over Nubians into the rock at the edge of Ta-Seti's own territory. Coincidence, conquest, economic strangulation, climate, or some combination of all four? The honest answer is that we know less about the end of Ta-Seti than we know about almost any other major transition in early Nile Valley history, and that the silence in the record is itself part of the tragedy. Because silence is not nothing. Silence is what it looks like when 1,000 small lives, boatmen, potters, farmers, archers, the unnamed man in Tomb L24, stop being recorded, not because nothing happened to them, but because the systems that might have recorded them collapsed, moved, or were absorbed into someone else's story. Think about what that silence actually contains. 1,000 years is not an abstraction. It is roughly 40 generations. It is long enough for a language to drift into something its speaker's ancestors would not recognize. Long enough for the memory of who built a particular tomb or why a particular crown mattered to dissolve entirely, not destroyed in an afternoon, but worn away slowly, the way a riverbank is worn away, until one day there is simply nothing left standing where something used to be. When a new culture, the C group, eventually re-emerges in Lower Nubia around 2400 BCE, Its people build different kinds of graves, make different kinds of pottery, and leave no clear indication that they remember Ta-Seti at all. Whatever stories the descendants of the A group told about their ancestors' kings, their wealth, their crowns and falcons and incense burners. If those stories survived the gap, they did not survive in any form archaeology can recover. The kingdom did not just lose a war, if it lost a war. It lost the right to be remembered by the people who came after it in its own homeland. And yet, and this is the part of the story that the word vanished gets completely wrong. The people did not vanish. The region did not stay empty. Nubia as a whole was not erased. What happened instead is one of the great reversals in ancient African history, and it took almost 2,000 years to complete.